Hello, my name's Gary Ford, Managing Director of Tiger Hobbies Limited, UK hobby importers and distributors. And welcome to part 2. In this part, we'll look at the US Army preparing for war in the 1930s. And what I'm going to do first is look at the basic organisation of the United States Army. First, there is the United States Regular Army. Then the United States Army Reserve. Both these personnel swear allegiance to the Constitution of the United States. Then there is a third army, the National Guard. Now, this may be equipped and funded by some federal funding, but are under direct control of the state governors. Then finally, a large dormant army that's been inactive since 1973 and the end of the Vietnam War and the end of the draft. This is the Army of the United States. Now, going back, there was a thing called the National Army in the First World War, but in the 1930s it was renamed the Army of the United States and was activated in February 1941 and expanded after the attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor. In fact, on the 13th of December 1941, all personnel joining the United States military, either drafted, volunteered, enlisted or commissioned, would go straight into the Army of the United States. So in theory, the regular US Army ceased to be after the 13th of December 1941. For instance, Dwight D. Eisenhower was a colonel in the regular army, but became a 3 or even 4-star general in the Army of the United States. And this is the army that will expand from 180,000 to over 11 million by 1945. So I'm showing a clip, stock footage of US Army using their trucks in the 1930s. And in fact here I've got one of our mini art trucks that we sell at Tiger Hobbies, a typical late 30s, early 40s US Army truck. This one wasn't sent overseas, it was mainly used in America. But now I'm going to talk about the American Army in the early or to mid 1930s. Now the American Army, the US Army, was in a bit of a poor state. It was only small, around about 170, 180,000. It was ranked 16th or 17th in the world. It had got very little motor transport to say this is the country that gave us the car. And it had got thousands and thousands of horse cavalry. I'm showing behind me a picture of one of the most famous US officers of the war. We all think about Eisenhower as being the big officer, but Eisenhower had a boss. And this chap here, George C. Marshall, was Eisenhower's ultimate boss, the senior soldier in the United States Army. Now, he joined the United States Army in 1902, and by the First World War, he was Assistant Chief of Staff to the brand new 1st United States Infantry Division, better known as the Big Red One. Now, whilst on a troop ship going to France, he bunked with a Major Leslie J. McNair, and these bonded very, very quickly and became great colleagues throughout the 1930s and in fact right through World War II until McNair's untimely death on a blue-on-blue incident where bombers of the United States 8th Air Force during Operation Cobra dropped a bomb on him and killed him. In one incident, in World War I, while the senior American general was visiting the 1st US Infantry Division, General Pershing, known as Blackjack Pershing, because he led African-American troops in the Spanish-American War, he asked if there was any problems. And Marshall said, yeah, we've got logistical problems. So Pershing said, well, what's the solution? While the rest of the people surrounding Marshall put their head in their hands thinking, you've killed your career. But Marshall told him the solutions, and for the rest of the war, Pershing sought this officer out for his advice. In 1938, by this time, he was a brigadier general and he worked in war plans. Also, he was Deputy Chief of Staff for the whole of the US Army. And again, at a meeting with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where Roosevelt had been given advice that the US military needed a large, expanded air force and a smaller army, Marshall again popped up with the rest of his colleagues with their heads in their hands saying, yes, you've killed your career again. and said, no, Mr. President, we need a much larger army, ground force, and we'll need lots of divisions, infantry division, armour divisions, as well as a large, complex logistical system to support the US Army from factory to the front line. Roosevelt said to his aide, whoever that officer is, I want him by my side if we go to war. I want somebody who's going to tell me that I'm wrong. I don't want no sycophant when we've got young American boys who may be dying. So, in July 1939, Brigadier General Marshall, now General George C. Marshall, 34th in seniority of American generals, was given the job of acting Chief of Army Staff, the most senior soldier in the United States Army. One of the first officers that General George C. Marshall called was Leslie J. McNair and put him in charge of training and asked him his advice what kind of training this would be. McNair said, we're going to do ground-up training. All the different branches of the United States Army have different training schemes. We need one single training scheme. As new soldiers come into the Army, they're trained on the same schedule. It's no use having the best corps commanders, divisional commanders, brigade commanders, regimental commanders, even battalion commanders, if Private Jones and Buck Sergeant Poindexter can't do their jobs. So we need a training system where every single soldier must first and foremost be able to use the M1903 standard service rifle, later the M1 Garand, and be able to use these weapons effectively. This will pay dividends later on in the Battle of the Bulge, when Cooks, Clarks and supply guys would fight in the front lines against some of the most elite units of the German army, the Waffen-SS. I'm showing clips behind me of the US Army on exercise prior to World War II. Now, they had to hold a series of exercises because since World War I, they'd not been used to handling vast amounts of men. So started with about 30,000 up to about 100,000. It's about as much as they could have with the size of the army. Now, they made the mistakes but learnt very quickly. Also, Marshall asked staff to look at and identify companies that could produce weapons for the United States Army if they had to expand into war production. He was also asking the President, FDR, if he could expand the army, but FDR was having problems getting it through Congress. But in September 1939, with the start of World War II in Europe, Congress started to pass acts to expand the US military. And in fact, in November 1940, the draft was finally brought in. In 1941, once the US Army had expanded quite dramatically, it held one of its largest exercises, in fact ever, in the Texas-Louisiana area, known as the Louisiana Maneuvers. This was 450,000 personnel. It resulted in 61 soldiers being killed. Can you imagine losing 61 soldiers now in a modern military exercise? They'd be asking questions right up the top. But they wanted to make it as realistic as possible. One of the lessons they learnt from this exercise was horse cavalry. On this exercise, the US Army used 27,000 cavalry. And in fact, in many cases, the cavalry outperformed a lot of the other units. But the writing was on the wall for the end of cavalry. Now, other people would use cavalry throughout World War II. The Germans, for instance, and the Russians, Cossacks on both sides. But for the US Army, the days of cavalry was over, and what they needed was mechanised cavalry. In the last series, I mentioned a meeting just after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. Well, I've looked into this, and this was actually the Arcadia Conference, held in Washington from the 22nd of December 1941 to the 14th of January 1942, where the presidents and prime ministers, not just Britain and the United States, but Australia, Canada, New Zealand and many more, discussed the future of the United Nations and in fact adopted the United Nations Declaration. It was also at this meeting that Antwerp was identified as an important port as a logistical springboard to assault Germany. They also discussed the combined command structure, where America would generally take the lead. Not in all cases. For instance, in Burma, under the Southeast Asia Command, Lord Louis Mountbatten was in charge, but generally it was Americans. But the Americans didn't get it all the way. The British convinced FDR that Marshall's plan to invade Europe in 1942 would be a massacre. And really, just like the British, the Americans would need to go somewhere to learn to fight. And that place would be North Africa, where the British were in operations at that time. In part 3, we shall now look at the US Army operations in Europe in 1944 and the supply crisis that blighted the Allied armies, in some way caused by the British not getting Antwerp fully operational until end of November 1944 into December 1944.